instead of focusing on the military, let's focus on the diplomatic, because the diplomatic is linked to policy. Military is a tool, but you don't wage a war just to wage a war. You wage a war to get an objective. And the initial objective of the Russians was to get Ukraine to the negotiating table. Every military operation, as Andrei said early on, was linked to a specific pressure point designed to get Ukraine to bring a rapid end to this conflict. Russia didn't plan on a 3-day. I mean, look, the people that came up with the quick Russian victory, General Miley, briefing Congress, the director of the CIA, briefing the president, and stuff, Scott Ritter, believing that Russia was going to war, who as well, who among us sat there and went, I know what Russia's going to do. Russia's going to do a special military operation, not a war. They're going to go in just to shape the diplomatic battlefield. Who was talking about diplomacy? We gave up on the diplomacy discussion after the U.S. and NATO rejected the Russian draft treaties that were submitted, I believe, on 17 December of 2021. Yeah. The second that was rejected, we in the West, myself included, who should have known better, because I know the Russians, I know how they think, I know that the primacy they place on diplomacy. I went, well, diplomacy's over. They're going into military technical means. That means war. That means popping them in the face. That means they're going to roll over them, because the Russians should have rolled over them, could have rolled over them if they had gone in whole hog. But that wasn't the Russian mission. And what we've learned since then is that Russia continued direct negotiations with the Ukrainians all the way up to the very beginning of the conflict, trying to get the Ukrainians to accept a negotiated settlement that was, from the Russian perspective, was extremely reasonable. Now, once the Russians started this, they started talking about demilitarization, denazification, but that was a lot of posturing. How do we know? Because when you look at the details of the agreed upon treaty, there was no demilitarization. There was no denazification. Russia basically said, hey, all we want is no NATO. That's what we really want. And then we'll work with you on everything else. As Andrei said, Russia, the Ukrainians didn't push the Russians back from Kiev. Russia withdrew from Kiev, withdrew from Chernihiv, withdrew from Sumy area voluntarily as a good faith measure, a confidence building measure to show the Ukrainians that they were serious about what they were negotiating. They said, we're not here to occupy your country. We'll withdraw. The Ukrainian mistake was not accepting what the Russians gave, because had they done so, then Kherson would be Ukrainian today. Zaporizhia would be Ukrainian today. And the Donbass would be having an internationally monitored referendum that meets every standard. Nobody in the West could complain about what their future would be, in accordance with the United Nations Charter and the principles of the UN that speak of self-determination. But no, instead, Ukraine listened to NATO. Now, we all know about the $45 billion lend-lease to build up, et cetera. Let's talk about the second Russian diplomatic phase. This was what to do now about the Donbass. Because the first phase was, we want to turn the Donbass over to an internationally moderated solution. Now that Ukraine has said no, we have to fix this problem in the Donbass, because Russia had recognized the independence of the Donbass, but Russia can't have the Donbass being independent like that. That's a non-starter solution in an environment where you are now confronting Ukraine and the collective West. So diplomacy part two was to create the conditions to absorb the territories of the Donbass into Russia, but this can't be done in isolation, because Ukraine has decided to extend the conflict. You must now absorb those territories that constitute the land bridge connecting Crimea to Russia. So this is Kherson and Zaporizhia. So now that's the diplomatic thing to do. That's the diplomacy. What is the military operation in support of this? Here's where some interesting things come into play. You're listening to Vladimir Putin and his advisors talk about the decision-making that was going on in the late summer, early fall of 2022. Today, we take it for granted that sanctions failed, and people like me who got it right, in December, saying there's no way sanctions will succeed. Russia's going to win. Well, I'm honest enough to say I'm not an economist. I had a gut feeling based upon some assumptions that I made, but I didn't have sound economic logic. I couldn't sit there and say, because of this aspect of the Russian economy, et cetera, they would win. And what we now know is that the Russians did not share my optimism, that the Russian government was actually extraordinarily concerned about extreme economic tightening, that they saw a contraction of 20 to 25% potential. And that contraction could create domestic political problems for Russia, especially if combined with a rapid acceleration of mobilization or violence on the Ukrainian front. So the Russians now had to match military objectives with diplomatic objectives. What do you do when you have insufficient forces to the task? Andrei, correct me if I'm wrong here. But one of the things you do is if you have land, you trade space for time. And so now you're saying, because why did the Russians not withdraw from the Kharkov area? Why did they maintain those troops there? Because it was a buffer for Lugansk and Donetsk. It is a physical buffer. But Russia doesn't have sufficient forces to man the totality of that line without mobilization, but they can't mobilize until they get political justification for that, something that the president can say, we have no other alternative but to do this. They knew that Ukraine was receiving tremendous amount of equipment. They knew that Ukraine was forming up this new army, because what everybody doesn't realize is that initial Ukrainian army, that 246,000 really well trained, they got slaughtered by the Russians from February until May of 2022. They annihilated them. The Russians wiped them off the face of the earth. Did Russia suffer casualties? Of course they did. Did the Ukrainians have nice videos of Russian tanks burning? Of course they do. But there's a lot of videos of Ukrainian equipment burning and a lot of dead Ukrainians at that time that nobody's talking about. That's why NATO had to pour in new equipment, and that's why NATO had to train tens of thousands of new Ukrainian soldiers. They came in and they did what the Russians wanted them to do. They attacked in Kharkov. And what did the Russians do? They withdrew. Did they suffer huge casualties? No. They traded space for time. And in doing so, created the political domestic environment where Putin could say, we have no choice now but to mobilize against not just Ukraine, because there's a lot of people in Russia that weren't happy with this Ukrainian special military operation. No matter how well Putin spoke, they didn't buy into it. But now collective West has come in. $45 billion Lend-Lease program, NATO trained army for the specific purpose, as Lloyd Austin said in May, to bring harm to Russia, to hurt Russia. And now Putin is able to mobilize, build the army he needs to build to accomplish phase 2 operations, which are stability on the front and absorption of these 4 territories, which they did successfully, by the way. And now we come to phase 3. Phase 3 is, what do you do now that Ukraine is on the verge of collapse? And as Andrei said, there's some meetings going on right now. And we don't know. There's some hints. You've heard rumors that they're talking about extending the special military operation to 2025, about building up the Russian military so that they have resources sufficient to the task of absorbing 5 more territories. Now we're starting to see the end game. The end game being put out there is, if you guys want to continue this war, we shall continue it. And when it finishes, there will be 5 more territories that are no longer part of Ukraine. And this is what denazification looks like, because they will reduce Ukraine to a rump state. And that rump state will be governed by a government handpicked by the Russians. I've spoken to the former deputy prime minister of Ukraine, and he said, look, we're looking at 3 to 5 years of military government in a post-conflict Ukraine, where we literally purge Ukrainian society of the Banderist element. They will no longer exist. They'll either have to flee, be killed, or be arrested, but they're not going to be allowed to stay here and do what they do. That's the future. Now, Ukraine has an option. Now that that's become apparent, Ukraine can say, oh, maybe we want to live with these 5 territories belonging to us with all the industrial potential and access to the Black Sea, thereby being economically viable, or we're just going to commit suicide and then we'll continue the fight. But there's a diplomatic element to this that people aren't paying attention to, that the military decisions being made are in support of a larger policy objective that is driven by Russian diplomacy. And you can't ignore that diplomacy. If you focus solely on the military, you'll be left scratching your head and you'll be making assumptions that aren't matched by reality.
Let me say this. The articles about, we've got Bill Crystal and his crew. They have an advertisement out now where they say, the Russians have lost 50% of their army. So what we hear is, constantly the Russians are losing. They've been losing. They're fighting with shovels. They're out of, missiles. They've been out of missiles since I don't know how they've had this much success. They've ran out of missiles 3 weeks into the special military operation. Yeah. Somehow, I guess they're using, catapults or something, for God's sake.
Yeah.
But one of the things that we see here is that it has always been necessary for the people running the U.S. empire to lie to their population about what's actually going on. A big part of this, of course, is money, and they want to keep the money flowing. And if the American people know the truth that once again, their money is going down a hole and nothing is ever going to come back as a result of it. In Afghanistan, they left $100 billion worth of military equipment there. Here, it's not going to be left there. It's going to be either blown to smithereens or taken back to the Russians for it to be studied or reconditioned and used by them back against the Ukrainians, whatever the case may be. But we've got 2 things going on here, I think. Number one, when it comes to that, the lies and misinformation about the Russians losing all of these people. Number one, the neocons have created this echo chamber. They've created this environment, this groupthink environment, wherein if you're a member of an intelligence organization and you look at the facts and you go to them and say, look, here's what's going on, and you give them the truth and they don't like it, you're out the door. You're done. So they've taught people in the intelligence community, only tell us what we want to hear. Sit back, look at the information, figure out what it is we would like to hear, what is the narrative that we want, and give us that narrative. Let me add this: if you work for the New York Times, the Washington Post, whatever the case may be, you already know if you go to your editor with an article and that article does not align with what Victoria Nuland and Jake Sullivan would want, you're out of work. So they've created an environment where they're constantly fed lies, where they have a media that feeds the people lies, and they really have to do it. Because if the people knew the truth, they wouldn't support it. The problem they have is reality asserts itself bit by bit with shows like this, and Andrei, Scott's doing his good work with the alternative media that has arisen over the last few years. People now have an opportunity to hear the truth. And once they hear the truth and they see that truth aligns with what they intuitively know, a lot of people intuitively recognize that they're being lied to, and they get the truth. It aligns with kind of what they feel anyway. And bit by bit, the bricks of the walls of these lies are being pulled out. It's falling apart now. And we see the instability created in U.S. politics. The reason Kevin McCarthy is gone right now is what? Because of a discussion over Ukraine aid. Our Congress is unstable right now. Because of what? A discussion over not aid to Ukraine, money that's going to go to Lockheed Martin so they can pretend to send stuff to Ukraine 3 years from now when it comes off the assembly line and there's no such place as Ukraine left.
Can I just say one quick thing about casualties, because we bring that up all the time, and everybody's like, well, you're just you're spewing Russian propaganda, and they say, well, the Russians haven't told us what their casualties are. They actually have been. Look, Vladimir Putin said that at one point in time the casualty ratio was 10-1 on the battlefield. at a time when he said that there was 71,000 Ukrainian casualties. So Vladimir Putin right then admitted to 7,100 Russian casualties during a very limited period of time. Okay, Russians are losing men. Russians are suffering casualties. And again, Andrei talked about, what General Kovalev is scale, scale, scale. Hey, man, if you're fighting a war of this scale, there are Russians dropping every day. If you're killing 1,000 Ukrainians a day, you're losing 100 Russians a day. In Vietnam, at the height of the conflict, that offensive, et cetera, we were bringing home 200, 220 body bags a week, and it broke the spirit of our country. The Russians are bringing home 100 body bags a day. What do you think's happening to Russia right now? They take this war seriously. This is one of the reasons why Russia is so united, because they are absorbing losses that we in America cannot comprehend. The total number of Russian dead, if we're talking 40,000 or 400,000 Ukrainian dead, and that's a conservative estimate, in my opinion. If it's a 10-1, that's 40,000, but really 10-1 was an optimistic. The actual kill rate ratio is probably 7 or 8-1, which means we're talking 50,000 Russian dead. All right, 50,000 Russian dead nearly matches, that's in 600 days, nearly matches what America lost in Vietnam in 10 years, in a decade. And if it's 50,000 dead, we're talking 150 plus thousand wounded. So let's not pretend that Russia isn't suffering casualties, and let's stop saying that Russia's lying about it. Russia isn't giving us specific casualty lists, but they've been pretty damn honest about this. Also, when counting Russian casualties, understand this. The Russian Ministry of Defense can only report those casualties that are attached to the Ministry of Defense. You know who wasn't attached to the Ministry of Defense? Wagner. So everybody's like, well, the Russian army's not telling the truth. Oh, they're telling the truth about the Russian army. But it's not their business to report Wagner casualties. It's not their business to report the some of the volunteer units, which are subordinated to the Russian National Guard, or the Donetsk Republic or the Lugansk Republic. The Russian army reports Russian casualties. There are other casualties out there, and if you learn how to read between the line, you can put the casualty figures together, and it's significant, but it ain't nothing compared to what they're doing to the Ukrainians. Just because the Russians are suffering this level of casualty, we would pray to have a kill ratio of 7 or 8-1. I mean, man, that means you're doing almost nothing wrong. If that's your kill ratio, you're doing everything right. This is just a war on a scope and scale that we in the West can't comprehend. There's a reason why the U.S. Army says we're going to lose 3,600 guys a day. That's because modern war is hell. We have no clue what's about to hit us if we ever want to go in this. All these people in the chat are, America's great, we can roll over. No. No, you can't. No, you can't. No, we can't. We're not bad, but we can't sustain it. We haven't prepared for sustaining it. A key aspect of sustainment is replacement troops. What do we replace the brigade that's going to be burned out in 2 days with? Another brigade? We only have 31 brigades in the U.S. Army. That's it, ladies and gentlemen. And half of them are earmarked for the Pacific because we're goofing off with China and talking about a war there. So let's break it down. We got 15 brigades for Europe. 15 brigades, you chew through one every 2 days. That's a month. We have enough active duty forces to last a month against it, but it won't be a month because we only have 2 weeks of ammunition. The losing a brigade every 2 days is assuming that we have logistical sustainability, that we have sufficient ammunition quantities, et cetera. We don't have any of that. And now we're throwing a last thing. Many assumptions are made about how a unit will perform in combat. We have built an American military that has this information overload going on. We learned it in the War on Terror. So our platoon commanders literally deploy to the front line with a laptop computer. And in the middle of a firefight, have that computer open. And they're sending reports back to their commanders who are sending it back to a group of people sitting in a bunker someplace looking at a command screen, and we're micromanaging everything. We have to have airplanes up doing communication relays. We have to have everything working perfectly. Let me tell you what happens when you go up against an enemy like Russia. Nothing works. It's not that nothing works perfectly. Nothing works. They will jam everything. So all this connectivity that we require, all this bandwidth we require to communicate will be shut down. So we will instantly lose all capability to perform any basic combat operations up to and including putting steel on target in the artillery. How do you get your targets? How do you program all this stuff? It ain't going to be happening. The American way of war requires satellite connectivity that isn't going to exist. So we will burn through our troops at a faster rate than 3,600 a day. We will be losing troops at a rate of about 5,000 to 6,000 a day. And now that 30 days is down to 15 days or even less. That's all the American military can do, and we're the best in NATO. There's not a NATO force out there that will survive more than a week against the Russians. This is the reality. So for all the people out there going, hey, we're killing Russians, best investment we ever had, you don't know what you're talking about. It's the worst investment because all we're doing is making Russia stronger every single day. The Russian military that exists today is orders of magnitude better than the Russian military that started this conflict in February, and that was a pretty damn good military. They have learned a lot of lessons that we haven't learned. They've incorporated new technologies, and Russia has perfected the art of mobilization. Man, when they started to mobilize back in September, October of last year, a lot of rust had to be kicked off the machinery. There was a lot of problems with that. Well, they have greased that up. They haven't just mobilized the 300,000. They've done 2 iterations of conscription successfully, absorbing a number of contract soldiers from that. Means their professionals have to go in and organize 300,000 volunteers and additional contract soldiers for the other units. The Russians have trained over 1 million men in the last year. Over 1 million men have been trained and equipped by Russia, and these men are being trained to modern combat tactics perfected against the Ukrainians, against a NATO-style Ukraine force. What is America doing? Hell, we can't even meet our recruitment goal of 60,000. We're 11,000 short, which means we have to actually drop units from the roll. We can't sustain the military that we think we have. We don't have that military. We don't have enough troops for that military. And if we send them to war, we won't have any troops for that military.
It comes back to what Scott talks about, which is, of course, very revealing article by Tradoc people, Training and Doctrinal Command from Pentagon. It was in U.S. Army War College Parameters. Very respectable, by the way, publication. One of very few. There are some stupid things, but Russians also write stupid things. So, so it's everybody does it. So, but it's respectable. And of course, they came. So, what are you going to do with your command post? How do you even deploy command post for, let's say, brigade, which will be a little bit deeper into the tactical rear? You cannot MCON, which is emission control everything. You will, you will emit, and once you emit, you will be detected. And you know what? Iraq didn't have calibers and kinjals and zircons. Russians do. So basically, they come up. Okay, you have to move nonstop. You have to. How do you do this? Can you imagine what staff headquarters of brigade, let alone division, look like? It's the unit onto itself. So. Yeah, and it's complete mess in terms of. That's why I kind of dragging. With my book, because I said until their active phase is over, I cannot say. Well, I have to say something now. Once the more political issue appeared, and now that we know that all those who matter, Putin, Medvedev, Patrushev, Lavrov stated, new 5 territories. And till 2020, Shoigu. So there you go. We know now.
Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.